You know, some songs are just background music. Others, they're like lightning in a bottle. But Lila, that's something else entirely. It's this 7-minute primal scream, right? And it's so much more than a rock classic. It's a raw, totally unfiltered diary entry about love, betrayal, and a full-blown obsession. So let's get into it. Let's pull apart the story that's woven into every single one of those famous notes. Yeah, a public exorcism of a private demon. That's honestly the only way to look at this. For Eric Clapton, this wasn't just about writing a hit song. No way. This was his therapy. It was this desperate public confession because he literally couldn't keep it inside anymore. He had this demon he needed to get out. And that demon? It was his completely all-consuming love for his best friend's wife. So how on earth does a forbidden love like that create one of the greatest rock anthems of all time? That's the big question, right? And that's exactly what we're going to dig into. Because believe me, the story behind Lila is every bit as dramatic, every bit as turbulent as the song itself. It's like a Shakespeare play, but with Fender Stratocasters instead of swords. All right, section 1, a dangerous friendship. And you got to understand, this whole story, it doesn't start with a song. It starts with this incredibly tight bond between two absolute guitar gods. Before all the obsession and the drama, there was a genuine friendship, a brotherhood. It was built on this deep respect and, a shared need to escape the absolute madness of being a superstar in the 1960s. Okay, so let's look at these two pillars. On one side, you've got Eric Clapton. People literally spray painted "Clapton is God" on walls. He was the blues purist. Then, on the other side, you have George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, the deep spiritual soul of, well, the biggest band in the history of the world. And they weren't just colleagues. They were super close. Neighbors, confidants. They'd spend nights just jamming, trading guitar licks, and basically hiding out from the craziness. It seemed like the perfect friendship. But at the very center of this perfect friendship was a third person. And that person was Pattie Boyd, George Harrison's wife. She was a huge model, the absolute quintessential it girl of the 60s, a total muse for the era. And she had no idea, but she was about to become the center of one of the most legendary and painful love triangles in rock history. So picture this. Clapton is over at the Harrisons' house all the time. He's just hanging out with his best friend and his wife. And slowly, maybe so slowly that even he didn't notice at first, his admiration for Pattie, it starts to change. It morphs, it twists into something way more intense. A really powerful and really dangerous obsession that was about to spiral completely out of control. Okay, section 2, the madman's muse. So here's Clapton, right? He is absolutely drowning in this secret, forbidden love. He needs an outlet. He needs some way to understand what's happening to him. And he ends up finding it in probably the last place you'd expect, a 12th century Persian poem. So a friend hands him a book. It's called The Story of Layla and Majnun. Think of it as like the Romeo and Juliet of the East. It's this ancient story about a guy who falls so deeply in love with a woman named Layla that her family forbids them from ever being together. And he completely loses his mind from the heartbreak. He wanders the desert just writing poems about her, and people start calling him Majnun, which means the madman. When Clapton read this, it was like a light bulb went off. A huge one. The parallels were just devastatingly perfect. First, you have the prohibition. He couldn't be with the woman he loved because of the ultimate social rule. She's married to your best friend. Then you've got the obsession. He completely saw himself as a modern-day Majnun, a man being driven to the brink of insanity by this love. And crucially, this gave him a name for her, Lila. It became his secret, tragic code name for Pattie. So now we get to section 3, forging the masterpiece. Armed with this new identity, seeing himself as the madman, Clapton puts together a new band. He calls them Derek and the Dominoes, basically to hide from his own fame. They pack up, head to a studio in Miami, and, fueled by a whole lot of drugs and just pure raw desperation, they start to record. And this is where the story takes another crazy turn. You know that iconic opening riff, right? It's one of the most famous guitar licks in history. You can probably hear it in your head this very second. Well, Eric Clapton didn't write it. Nope. The melody was actually borrowed or, lifted from a vocal part in an old blues song by Albert King. It was a cool melody for sure, but it wasn't that world-changing, electrifying guitar riff yet. It needed something more. It needed a spark. And that spark, man, was it a big one. His name was Duane Allman. Yeah, the Duane Allman, the legendary slide guitarist from the Allman Brothers Band. He just happened to be in Miami and got invited to the studio. He and Clapton hit it off instantly. It was like they were psychic or something. And it was Duane who took that little blues vocal melody, cranked up the speed, and transformed it into that screaming, immortal guitar riff we all know and love. And what about the lyrics? Layla, you've got me on my knees. I mean, come on. There's no fancy poetry here, no deep metaphors. This is just a raw, primal scream of a plea. All that stuff about the ancient Persian poem, it just melts away. This is Eric Clapton, the man, begging the woman he's obsessed with to please, please put him out of his misery. And this is so crucial to understanding the song. It's really two songs stitched together. The first part, that's the rock section. It's all fire and pursuit and screaming guitars. It's that insane duel between Clapton and Allman. But then, it all changes. You get to the second part, that beautiful, sad piano piece at the end. That was actually written by the drummer, Jim Gordon. And that's the sound of the aftermath. It's the exhaustion, the ash after the fire. The energy just collapses. The tempo slows right down. It's the sound of weeping after all the screaming is done. Okay, section 4, the cautionary tale. So the masterpiece is finished. It's on tape. But for the actual people living this story, things were just getting started. The song might have been this epic fantasy, but reality was about to come crashing down, hard. So get this, they're all at a party, and Clapton finally does it. He walks up to George Harrison and just tells him, "I'm in love with your wife." Can you imagine? And what's even crazier is how George reacts. He's apparently super calm, turns to Pattie, and just asks her to choose right there. And she chooses George. She stays with her husband. Clapton is just completely and utterly rejected. And he is absolutely crushed by this. He just spirals downward. He becomes a total recluse, vanishes from the public eye, and sinks into a brutal 3-year-long heroin addiction. And to just pour salt in the wound, the song, Layla, the one he poured his entire soul into, comes out, and it's a total flop. Nobody buys it. The world just wasn't ready for that kind of raw emotion, I guess. But the story doesn't end there. A few years later, in 1974, George and Pattie's marriage does end. And then, in 1979, Eric Clapton finally gets what he wanted. He marries Pattie. He marries his Layla. But here's the thing. The reality could never, ever live up to the fantasy of the song. The burning obsession that created this incredible work of art, it turns out it's not a great foundation for a marriage. They ended up divorcing 10 years later. So the real-life relationships crumbled. But the song, Layla, was just getting started. Which brings us to our last section, the legacy of Layla. How did this song, born from so much heartache and pain, end up becoming immortal? Well, this right here shows you everything. Fast forward to 1992. Clapton does an unplugged album, and he completely reinvents Layla. He takes away all that electric guitar, all that aggression, and he turns it into this slow, kind of jazzy, reflective blues shuffle. And guess what? It was a monster hit. Won a Grammy. It was incredible proof that the emotional heart of this song was so powerful it could work in any style. It could go from being about a young man's painful obsession to an older man's quiet reflection. In the end, I think Clapton himself summed it up perfectly. He said, "It was a song I had to write to survive." Think about that. This wasn't just him trying to write a song. This was a necessity. It was survival. He basically took the ancient pain of the madman and handed him a Fender Strat. He had to get all that feeling out. And in the process, he created something that would end up outliving him, outliving all of them. And that leaves us with this one big lingering question, doesn't it? Layla is, without a doubt, a masterpiece. It's a timeless piece of art. But it was born from so much real, human pain that deeply affected a lot of people's lives. And it just makes you wonder, is the greatest art worth the pain it costs to create it? Is the masterpiece worth the misery? I don't know the answer. That's a question each of us has to answer for ourselves.